Wow, thank you very much, Arvid and Marie and the Soft Protest Digest for this travel to a parallel present. I hope you all had a smooth travel with us, and it's from this fictional present that I would like to welcome you to the second day of the second edition of the Urgency Intensive. And as we have said before, this year we proposed the IPACC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Art and Climate Change, as an object for discussion. Yesterday, we had really amazing discussions, as Hisham has already pointed out. And today and tomorrow, the focus of our conversations will be the IPACC in itself. For that, we have drawn inspiration from a decision-making and political movement Japanese researchers are implementing called Future Designs. And we will have a group of professionals divided into two smaller groups, one enacting the present, this parallel present, and another one enacting a future that is 7 generations ahead of us. Today, we have 2 different roundtables, starting with this one in the morning, where the group of the present will discuss prospectively what the IPCC can bring, what are its shortcomings, and what can be its potentialities. And in the afternoon, starting from 2 Central European time, we'll have a roundtable with a group of the future that will look retrospectively at what the IPACC has achieved, what were its shortcomings, and what were its successes. Both groups will be in conversation tomorrow in the third day for the assembly, where Arvid and Marie will take us to a point outside of time so that both groups, present and future, can converse. These 2 days are Zoom meetings and not webinars as yesterday. So we would like to have you all attending, present in the discussion. And later on, we will open the Q&A and the discussion for all the attendees. So make sure you have your questions ready and make sure we can also see you and hear you. I would like to introduce Inga Latte, who I have the pleasure to co-curate this event with, and who will give us more information about her side of this fictional present.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Bruno. Good morning. So basically, to delve deeper into this question of time, so this and the background of why future design. So this principle of inclusion, a forthcoming generation in the decision-making process, has deep connections with the 7th generation principle of indigenous cultures, which urges the current generation of humans to live and work for the benefit of the 7th generation ahead. So it's about 140 years into the future. And the 7th generation notion takes root in the founding document of the Iroquois Confederacy, a historical indigenous confederacy in North America. And the oldest living participatory democracy on Earth. And this philosophy is also common in many other Native American nations and indigenous peoples around the world. And we would also like to thank Professor Tatsuyoshi Sayo, who is the founder of Future Design, for his help and inspiration in sharing the insights into the method, because we are very happy to use it and to try it out these days. And so just to go back a little bit to yesterday, that may also kind of bridge some pathway to today in relation to long-term thinking. And we've had really insightful and beautiful discussions with chairs of the actual IPCC that we are referring to in our kind of imaginary of the IPACC. And writer Roman Znaric and artist Carolina Caicedo were also there to open up this possibility of arts and culture to be this partner for imagination and different speculative scenarios, and also engaged work to change the paradigm of extractive capitalism or of this extraction that we are so used to in relation to nature, instead of art being just an illustrator. So that was something that really came up yesterday, like illustrator or representator of different problems. And then, another thing that came was this tension between the urgency with which the climate crisis should be treated and the long-term approach which we are proposing or exercising or thinking about, which also it requires, right? And another important point that raised discussion was how not to how to learn but not to instrumentalize the knowledges that we take from, for instance, indigenous people, or and like how to always check oneself, weaving in ways of giving back or giving visibility, and so with all these thoughts that we've already gathered, we are very happy to enter this day, and I'm happy to introduce Taru Elfving, who will moderate the first discussion of the present. And Taru Elfving is a curator, a researcher, and writer based in Helsinki, Finland, and her practice focuses on nurturing transdisciplinary encounters and site-sensitive artistic investigations at the intersections of ecological, feminist, and decolonial thought. And as artistic director of CAA Contemporary Art Archipelago, she's currently working in collaboration with contemporary artists and environmental scientists on the research project Vectors in Change on the island of Saili in the Baltic Sea. So please welcome Taru.
Thank you, Inga. And thank you very much for this invitation. What an amazing event. And yesterday was really, truly inspiring last night. So I've got a lot of notes on that already, that hopefully everybody's making a lot of notes, and because the idea is that we will have an open discussion a lot, at different stages today and tomorrow. But to our group. So our group has been invited to think, speak, and listen from the present. Representing the present, we also feel quite strongly that we represent the future past. And moreover, we acknowledge that the present is not one, but many, and time is neither a linear narrative of progress nor a future apocalypse. Climate breakdown is already lived by many. It is not only that of the future, but also of the past. The present is therefore marked by the urgency to not only prepare for the future, but also to repair past damage. I think this came up quite strongly also yesterday in the discussions. But our role today is to think prospectively on how an intergovernmental panel on art and climate change could come about. So what could be the agency of art and creative practices in relation to climate emergency and ecological breakdown? What could be the significance and roles of the IPACC 7 generations ahead? What are the transformations the IPACC could bring to the future? What should be implemented now to sustainably achieve these long-term goals? We will start with short presentations now and a conversation between the speakers, but hoping that this will feed and nurture an open discussion that will follow. And I encourage everybody to write questions already as we go to the chat, and so that we can return to them later on when we have a number of occasions to talk together. So I thought that I'll introduce the speakers, all the 3 speakers now. I'm really happy to be able to share this moment, this sort of virtual roundtable with these 3 speakers, and to then open up from there. So Fernando García-Dory's practice engages the relationship between culture and nature as manifested in multiple contexts, from landscape and the rural to desires and expectations in relation to identity, crisis, utopia, and social change. His work addresses connections and cooperation from microorganisms to social systems, and from traditional art languages, collaborative agro-ecological projects and actions. Fernando's work has been shown at Tensta Konsthall, Van Ape Museum, Reina Sofia Museum, Documented 12, and Biennales of Guangzhou, Istanbul, and Athens, amongst others. Since 2010, he has been developing a project called Inland, in which he dissolves his authorship. And I actually thought that I would introduce all the three speakers now, and then we can sort of have more flowing sort of presentations from one to the next. So then Nataša Petrešin is an independent curator, editor, and writer. Interdependent. Beautiful, Nataša. Among the exhibitions she has curated are Contour Biennale, Colton and Scotten in Mechelen, 2019. Let's Talk About the Weather, Art and Ecology in Times of Crisis, with Nora Razian, Sersok Museum, Beirut, and Guangdong Times Museum, Guangzhou, 2016-18. She also curates the project Not Fully Human, Not Human at All, organized by Cadiz, Paris, from 2017 to 21. And she's currently editor-in-chief of Versopolis Review. She's also co-founder of the Initiative for Practices and Visions of Radical Care with Elena Sorokina. And in 2021, Nataša has been appointed Cultural Programs Manager at the Cité International des Arts, Paris. And then our third speaker, Suzanne Dhaliwal, is a climate justice creative, campaigner, researcher, lecturer in environmental justice, and trainer in creative strategies for decolonization. She's the co-founder of the UK Tar Sands Network, and she has led campaigns and artistic interventions to challenge fossil fuel investments in the Arctic and Nigeria that violate the rights of indigenous peoples. Suzanne has lectured globally on white supremacy in environmentalism and has offered creative strategy workshops to decolonize activism and to find creative strategies to recenter Indigenous, Black, people of color, and frontline voices in climate media and communications. She's also working as a consultant at Indigenous Climate Action and the Indigenous Environmental Network. So much more could be said about these three speakers, but I'll let them speak instead. And I thought maybe in the beginning as well, because we are kind of in this virtual roundtable now, that this conversation really kind of calls for being grounded. So maybe everybody could also state in the beginning where they're speaking from at this current moment. So I shift the kind of the mic from virtual mic from Helsinki now to Fernando first, and then Nataša, and then Suzanne.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Taru. Thank you, Inga and Bruno, and all Jan van Eyck for putting this object together. That I think is really already super inspiring and enriching a lot. You know, the possibilities to think about where we are and where we could be. Yesterday started very, very interestingly as well. I think that also we have to recognize that the value of this object as a design object as well, in the sense that I've been in UN discussions of operational groups, for example, and they end up with just like Zooms with chats in which they say, for example, Belarus supports Russia, and then Trinidad Tobago supports whatever. So I mean, it's really sometimes difficult to think in this virtual realm now to create forms of engagement and to resonate further, no, than what the screen allows. But well, it's great that we are getting used to the system in terms of low carbon form of discussion fora. And well, I told Taru I would start first. I don't know why I said that, but I think I will try to add to the questions she was prompting for this first session of the present. And I would start by asking some general questions that would connect with some of my practice and then hopefully feed into the whole process of these 2 days. First of all, if we were now really considering how there would be an arts component within the IPCC, the first thing I would ask myself is, who is the commissioner? Like, who am I talking to? Who is like calling me now? And then I think that it would be important to consider the different possibilities here. For example, we could be being like part of a UN body, a specific department within, for example, the whole building of FAO or the whole building of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification of many of the UN bodies that have been created, and then we would be dealing with the let's say the haute fonctionnariat, no, the high end bureaucracy at a global level. we would be being asked to come in by scientists, and then we would be just part of, let's say, an independent network of specialists within the fields, but also it could be part of a civil society movement. Wanted to share just some images of my experience within that, if I manage, sorry. Because I started in 2007 to work at this realm of the international fora by proposing a world gathering of nomadic peoples, a world alliance of nomadic peoples, no? That would involve an assembly and then to question different problems and challenges, no? That they are facing at their local level. And for me, it was also an experience of modeling futures. We started with a 7 days gathering and started by asking all the representatives, the 300 nomadic peoples from more than, I think it were more than 80 countries, asking about, imagine you wake up one day in one decade, how would you like to see your communities, your land around, your animals, your territories? And then the second day we asked them, okay, from that vision to what you have now as main obstacles, what are the difficulties, the problems that make that vision to seem unattainable? And then the third day we started to work on the ways to somehow go over those limitations. The experience since then has been very, well, I would say I've been quite absorbed, because the process of coming from that gathering into an organization that had this global scope, the World Alliance of Nomadic Peoples, also allowed us to try to find ways to interfere in the many discussions being held at the UN system. And we realize now in this moment that actually there is a moment of deep questioning of the role of civil society movements and the spaces of participation that have been opened to be continued in the future. What I mean is that, for example, we are now in a moment in which we are about to maybe leave the discussions on the space of the civil society mechanism that was created by the Food and Agriculture Organization to discuss on food sovereignty, because the UN decided, for example, that the World Food Summit will happen together with the World Economic Forum. Imagine what that means. It means that you bring the space of civil society discussion on food, that is a basic right, to the Davos bunch of people, no? Like the super elite. So I think this is very symptomatic of the moment we are in which civil society is progressively diminished or just taking into a form of let's say, cosmetic appearance. And then the chances to really influence are less and less. I think also that we should ask ourselves, who are we, as cultural producers, the cultural realm, because it's really heterogeneous. It's not a single thing. Well, the artists. Well, I think it's composed by, for example, different ways of understanding art. There is like the notion of art as we would see it, I don't know, in Art Basel, Miami. or in in whatever space of spectacular art, and that sometimes is what is coming into the UN nations. I've been in UN meetings about the future of oceans, and then having like huge sculptures of plastics, making things to show like so this kind of a spectacular like thing of wow, it's bombastic, and Instagram art is there, and how far we relate with that, because this is the easy catch, when we say let's convene a message to society. So then we have also utilitarian design, and I think Jan van Eyck is beautifully bringing the art thinking with the design thinking, and the idea of making a design for the 99% of the people, and making things that are like challenging climate change, and it's like let's say changing horses on the go, and then the question of an art world that maybe, for example, I could feel I connect to an art world that is like questioning even the art world itself, but it's also very much dominated by a system of influences, a hierarchy. Like where are the theorists? Where are the curators? What are the curators for? Would be the curators leading the conversation? The curators at some point appeared in the contemporary art historical moment because they were mediators between the artist and society because of the progressively complex language that contemporary art was becoming. So when we said, okay, science is very complex, we cannot go to the people with that. Let's go to art. But sorry, but art has become like a super difficult, sophisticated, self-referential ivory tower language for the connoisseurs. So do we need the curators to keep mediating? Will they be the artists of artists? Because we cannot really, as artists, go beyond our complex making and then they go into managerial aspects of running an exhibition. So let's think that they come to the artist, they talk to us and they say, okay, we want you to start to work with this. So then I will wonder, okay, what is our expertise? What can we offer? What is that we are really good at? Are we like consultants? I remember a very, very interesting example that really influenced me a lot when I started to develop this idea of expanded sphere of social intervention and social plastic. That was the artist placement group in the 70s. And I think that was a very beautiful moment in which the artists were just brought with their specialties to work with, I don't know, British Airways to work with. So I take as a reference, but also I think that the artists now that we have around often have been formed with the wrong assumptions, the wrong values, the wrong mediums, and the wrong skills. I mean, we are like the sons and the daughters of a system that has been evolved in the 60s, 70s, globalization, galleries, careerism, the cult for the new, shocking the viewer, being unique, all these things that actually make us to feel like super privileged and to just be operators of, as I said, a very, very inaccessible language way of. So the next question I would ask myself would be what for? What for to have artists in the IPCC? Well, this body is formed by designers that make graphics onto, scientists, philosophers, behavioral scientists, we were hearing about this yesterday, system dynamics, computer engineers. All this becomes like a think tank that is really efficient on processing information. It's a little bit like what I was in a residence in Cambridge, and there was the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. And this is amazing because you had like people like the Royal Astronomer thinking how the world will cease to exist because of nanotechnology getting crazy or whatever. But what I mean is that there is already a very sophisticated and complex body that is combining knowledge and information to depict scenarios, to project tendencies, to point at bifurcations and to speculate on futures. So this is being done, and then how this is transferred to society into imaginaries. Well, I start to think that the futures are really super well depicted by the media, film, and what I would call the cultural entertainment complex. You know, if you think in the military industrial complex and then the pharmaceutical, there is like the complex that feel of content our screens and is like depicting futures and creating scenarios, and that's really reaching a lot of like the broader society that have access to these platforms of dissemination, cultural or entertainment content. So I question then, what for? I mean, the problem is not then to project and to think, but actually is not to imagine either. I think it's more to implement the politicization of these visions, the politicizations of these pointings. And this is the question. The scientists have been like covered with the white coat as the neutral observer. No? This is coming from Enlightenment. And then it's like apolitical. Well, now we just have to start to question this for the art, because the art has been also very much taken since the l'art pour l'art movement in the 19th century, also to that sphere of apparent neutrality. Like we don't engage with politics, we're just creating references and so on. I think that art can really be disturbing. It questions the frame, it questions the box we are thinking usually, and actually it would question even the climate problem, in the sense that I think that sometimes some political theorists are also pointing at the climate problem or the climate crisis as just a way to, let's say, project in a form of biospheric, atmospheric, far distant problem and shared agency, a question that relates with our everyday and actually the way we operate with material resources, energy flows and so on. It's like also not just the air and the atmosphere and the meteorology, it's also the land, is the use of resources and waste, it's extinction. So we actually have to talk about the paradigm that is bringing climate change, that is thermocapitalism and post-industrialism in some cases. So let me just, if I have a moment to share the screen once more. Are we still on time? Let me try, because the thing is that the screening was not working very well. Okay, I try to move faster. So, well, some images of the nomadic peoples. But yesterday, I think that the last speaker was very interestingly putting a little bit of a point in what we should look at. No? I remember we were asked to make a poster for an exhibition, and this is the poster we came at in Inland. No? Like this was before Corona, so it was a moment in which I was in the mountains, looking all the planes coming out back and forth, stay in a place attentive, cultivating bounds to store food for the cold days that could be also warm. So I think this is maybe a little bit of our role. We are not just thinkers, we are makers, and we have to start to think on making scale models. So this was the idea of Inland, started 10 years ago, a form of a para-institution that would create the conditions to those other forms of being an artist, of thinking as well, how and to whom and where art happens. So producing knowledge, training, and also producing farm craft art produce that is traded to create a financial support to access to the land. This has a genealogy. For example, I remember in the reading about the 70s, 60s, 70s, early agroecologists in the times of Freire and Boal that were like coming from working in the fields to really work with peasant movements and farmers movement, especially in Latin America, but also in other places, and challenging the idea of the intellectual, finally, the specialized cultural worker to work in the field, for example, producing radio programs and so on. So that genealogy, if you remember, Taru, we were talking about this in Frontiers in Retreat when we were doing that project in Scotland, looking at the problem of land reform, that a Land Reform Act was published but not implemented. And then I was proposing like a future field agent, the artist as a local agent of agroecological dynamization. We don't use the word development much because it involves like the notion of growth and so on. So maybe think more on how we could become those field agents and how we could train the artists to be that. These are some of the projects we started in 22 villages with local communities that are actually pretty much also affected by climate change, and then becoming new curriculum, a project working with 9 universities around the continent and a village we are recovering as a kind of a village lab. So we bring the different practitioners from landscape studies, art, or engineering, and we create this form of new curriculum looking at subjects like mountain, how a mountain goes with an eucalyptus monoculture, but also transitions to native forest, how the village is a space of conviviality, how there could be new village contracts, the forest itself, and working, for example, with our inland member, Nell, who's a shepherd, or with artists like Hito Steyer, thinking on the dynamic of a national park. What is the problem with rewilding? How we work, for example, with cheese producers that are being affected by wolf attacks, and how this cheese, for example, that we produce actually could become also a currency, the cheese coin. So the importance of, as artists, not only to think on content, but to think on the continent, how we exist as an artist, how to create our economies and our systems of reference, to later engage with new alliances, for example, local villagers, to create systems of overcoming the everyday and characters and masks. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom and a cultural practice that we cannot just ignore. No? I think that we are spiritually very poor compared with those peasant and indigenous cultures that we have left behind. So it's a moment to rethink the whole paradigm and bring it back to society. So I think I would leave it here. This is like some of the project we do, like bringing the ship then to the city and creating like interfaces, spaces with the people in the city, so they relate to the other, to the animal, to the land with other eyes, not only with them. This is our mobile radio station / dairy, and well, I will leave it here. Hopefully, it makes sense of some kind.
Thank you, Fernando. Nataša, do you want to jump in straight away?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I would like first to thank you to all the who invited me and us and thought about this conference, as well as I would like to say hello to some friends that I see in the in the assembly here, at least on Zoom, and to say that I'm talking to you from Paris, where I live since now it will be 16 years, but I'm originally from Slovenia. And talking about interdependence, it's going to be one part of what I would like to say. So yes, indeed, about, Fernando, you gave us the food for thought, thought for food, food for thought, about the pertinence, the relevance, the existential questions of what can we expect from this present moment to stay there for the future generations. I think it's a really difficult exercise that we are invited to do. But thanks also to yesterday's speakers, there are techniques, there are ways of thinking and doing that involve a lot of our competencies that are based on empathy. And I think this is one of the key, let's say, phenomena that we can use as beings that are still called humans. I work, as Taru said in the introduction, I work currently a lot about, I'm very interested in thinking if human is still actually, as Olivier Marbeuf says, if it's still a desirable term, knowing that so many atrocities have happened throughout the centuries in the name of human and for the sake of humanity. So I think that this will be somehow questions that I would like to relate to in my presentation. I will speak from a very situated experience. Do you see this? Yeah, it's okay, great. So in the sense of questions about where to speak from, I decided to speak very much from an experience that I started together with my colleague, an interdependent curator, as I am, Elena Sorokina. So it's the Initiative for Practices and Visions for Radical Care that we based in greater metropole of Paris. So also everything that I will say somehow relates to my understanding, or let's say the knowledge that I have of the global North art system. So if it sounds a little bit abstract sometimes, I'll try to give an example of what we mean or what we try to do with it. And I would say that in that way, I would hope that this kind of small gestures that we are trying to do might have an influence in let's say, not only relationships that there exist in the art institutions and that are really, as I write here, infused with racial capitalism. So they are infused with, something so obsolete and so dangerous as white privilege or competitivity, instead of thinking that actually, you will see on my images that there are a lot of people smiling. And what if art could be something that is based on friendship and mutuality and not competitivity, but this all goes, of course, to the question of racial capitalism and capitalism as the system in which art is so much infused. And I agree with Fernando that there are many art worlds and there are many art systems, but the prevailing one still is the one that let's say, aspires and functions in some kind of, let's say, imposing of hierarchies of power, abuse of power. We have seen a lot in the last years of undermining, with the movement of Me Too, Black Lives Matters. There is a whole movement of not only of civic, but really art-related and art-inspired movements that are getting against the oppressive behavior that exists in the art system. So I'm trying to speak about how could this art system that still exists there and that is in a way that can be transformed, I believe, into spaces of humbleness, interdependence, and really importantly, that this happens first on a local level. And I think this is something that we all agree that being situated is the way to go in order to deal with huger issues of climate urgency on one hand, but also the future, or many futures, as we have also heard yesterday. So the initiative just briefly started really from a long-term work that we both with Elena established. We are still calling ourselves interdependent curators by really, let's say, trying to think and practice the meaning of interdependence as something that is based on relationships of care and the understanding of mutuality as the only valid relationship that we should establish in order to respect each other and care for each other. It was established during, was actually launched in a way as a kind of indication to a group of artists that we have been working with for some time, or we have been in conversation with, who are living all in Greater Paris area and whose practices are based on care relationships. We are in a way, let's say, reclaiming the word of radical care because care has become also something that, especially in the pandemics, have been almost abused. So the radical care really wants to let's say, reclaim the notion of the importance of thinking about care in intersectional way, which means that we are thinking together race, gender, class, sexuality as those phenomena that coexist. And unfortunately in France at this moment, if you have been following recent conversations, it's not very inspiring, and it's not very, it's almost fascizing in the terms of the government actually understanding the theory of intersectionality as something that is prone to separatism and even Islamist extremism, as they call it. So they are launching a huge crusade. I would really use the word crusade to look into the academies, universities, to find the professors who are working with, for example, intersectional methods, who are working on issues of decoloniality. So I'm sorry because I'm getting stressed while speaking, but it is an extreme situation of present moment. So how to undo that when something on such a governmental level is coming towards you, you know? So they even coined it Islamo-leftism. So just to say that there is a total delirium in that. So in the initiative, we are a group of artists, curators, writers of very different backgrounds, but all somehow related to practices that we consider with Elena might become extinct in near future, not in 7 generations, but in less than 1 generation. So practices that are based on care, that are based on ethics, anti-racism, anti-sexism, and certain environmental understanding or understanding of the importance to work with the other as well as with who is either human or non-human. And we consider them being vulnerable because they will not be able to be supported through the existing art system because of the forthcoming economic crisis that we probably foresee all that will follow the current pandemics and the lockdown that is being let's say, put in place while there is too little, let's say, importance given to really taking this moment in order to transform our ways of thinking, working, doing on a larger political scale. Artists are either, some of them are asylum seekers, some of them are have the status of refugees, some of them are established artists from the existing art system. And we try to meet, we are having regularly picnic assemblies, we call them picnic assemblies, where we try to speak about where we are with certain projects, practices, problems, urgencies, and we try to see how with different competencies that each of them has, either with alliances or networks or personal or professional possibilities, we try to actually support and help each other. It's as easy as that. And we usually meet under a tree in public gardens of Paris. So that's also why here it's written, residing with others, talking to trees, rivers, animals, spirits. It's something that we do regularly, also because here next to the tree, I'm sitting with a big smile. I'm close to Kati Tutayasu, who is some people know who are here. She's educated as anthropologist, but is actually a shaman of Afro-Amerindian origin, and she's part of the initiative and a really important member of it. We are also trying to think, this is something that comes from my previous experience as well. When we work, and this comes very much in relationship to what Inga was saying in the introduction about how art cannot be, how artistic practice should not be only an illustrator or a representation. What kind of materials are we using? So tracing the materials, trying to think how, Fernando mentioned the plastic sculpture. So what kind of carbon footprint actually a material that is being used as artistic material carries, and how to talk about that, how to change that, how to work maybe with homegrown paper, or thinking about where does if I use the pencil, where does its material come from? What has it been done? What has been destructed in a way? So this is a kind of I would say something that we are speaking a lot about. Intersectional feminism is very important to us because, as Françoise Vergès has written in a large amount of her books, the cleaning and carrying of spaces that are there in order for art to be seen are carried by usually by the racialized bodies and racialized communities, mostly women. So that this cleaning and caring for spaces that we inhabit could be something that is mutualized, or that at least, for example, the relationship to those who are working with cleaning and caring for the spaces could be a transformed relationship within the institutions of art. And this I think we see way too little, and it happens, for example, whenever I start working in an institution, I always ask the members, because especially here in France, it's something that is quite present, that usually the services are outsourced, and nobody even knows the names of these people who are actually enabling that art takes place in something that we used to call some kind of white cubes or some kind of neutral spaces. And in order to go back to our questions, so how to transform those institutions, I would say that it's really important. Like it's not a coincidence that Jan van Eyck is doing this project now. Jan van Eyck being the place for residencies as well, and myself having started to work in one of the, I think it's the biggest, hugest space for artist residencies that exists since 60s in Paris, Cité Internationale des Arts. I think that we will understand that the residency, that not only that the residency, but that that the answers for us to think about the 7 generations ahead are already here, and they just have to be supported and looked at attentively. So, for example, residency that allows somebody to stay, not be thinking for a certain period of time about how to pay the rent for the artists, speaking, of course, or curators. Having the time to think, to be preserved in some way for some period of time in order to create, to relate to each other. I think the form of residency is something that we should take along and perhaps think even to transform all art spaces into residency spaces. You know, wouldn't that be wonderful? And to have community gardens around, and sheep, and food laboratories, and working with, for example, in Cité des Arts, we have this quite interesting, it's a bad word, but a very symptomatic cohabitation. There every night in front of it come a group of homeless people who stay there for the night. They sleep there. They have each their own space. The city is in relation with an intensive relationship with the association, who comes monthly to check on the situation. And many artists have been actually thinking about, like, while they were staying at Cité, there were some meals organized together with them and for them. And so how to, you know, can you imagine like a larger museum doing that as well, or trying to think about this kind of cohabitation? And you will see that there is not a lot of direct, let's say, speaking about climate urgency as such, but I think it really starts here. It really starts in first understanding how we are relating to each other in order to transform the relationship then with the non-humans and with our environment that we so radically are destroyed. So the routing is an important discussion for me. Understanding that through the pandemics, not only that you know that let's say the relationship to or the kind of transformation is possible of how we relate to each other, but also understanding that, as Eliseo Macamo says, that you know, the crisis is us. The crisis is us. It's a really a certain behavior that is related to racial capitalism that has been put in place for so long and for too long that we are where we are. So I would stay here with it, and of course get back to you when there are questions.
Thank you, Nataša. I know that we are already running a little bit late of the schedule, but we have quite a bit of time for discussion, so I'm not too concerned about that. So I don't want to stop you because everybody has so much to say. So Suzanne, and then we can continue. Is Suzanne there?
She's muted.
Okay. Suzanne, are you muted?
That's better.
Okay.
Too many tabs open. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much as well for the invitation and to this space. And actually, I've been so grateful for the prompt and the provocation to come into now, to come into the present so often with working at the intersection of climate justice and art. We are springboarded into the future or into the pains of colonialism and misogyny, which has got us to this moment. So I've really enjoyed the past few days of meditating on this idea of the present and presencing. And myself, I'm a daughter of a polymath, and my practice moves between art and activism. And so I really sort of think that it's important that we have this space to ask the question, what is art at this time? What is the human being? And especially as someone who moves between those spaces, as I said. So this first image here I just wanted to share is actually a megaphone, which I reversed the engineering within it so that it became a listening device. And I think it's a really important depiction of so much of the work and the research that needs to take place before we even get on a megaphone, before we even design our actions and our interventions. And so that's kind of the spirit with which I approached this presentation today, that there is a real history, recent history of art and activism working together. So I wanted to share a little bit of that history with you there today. So, as I mentioned, my work has primarily been looking at the intersection and the space where Indigenous rights, extractivism, and climate injustice are taking place. So this is actually the Canadian boreal forest on the top, what has now been desecrated and looks like the moon. You know, a lot of these future apocalyptic scenarios that we imagine are actually here, and the IPCC has already for the last decade been calling for the Canadian tar sands to be shut down. As you know, we've already hit the peak of conventional fuels, and instead of transitioning to a just future, we're now relying on heavy, dirty oils such as the Canadian tar sands. So this is taking place on the lands of Indigenous peoples. It's been going for 50 years. And there is actually no cumulative impact assessment of the projects. And the area is the size of England and Wales that has already been destroyed. So you can see that, again, as we think about the present, that it's really important that we understand that we already are in many of the scenarios that we think are coming into the future. And that's why it's important that, as well as climate change, we also talk about ecocide. So ecocide is currently being proposed as a new law, a new crime against peace, just like genocide. The territories that have been destroyed to this level, that there is criminal responsibility for the corporations and those involved in this. So I think that's one important thing that I want to bring to the table at the moment is, as well as future scenarios and parts per million and the carbon in the air, we have to think about the already existing devastation of territories. So this landscape is irrecoverable. You can't clean it up with carbon capture and storage technology. There's no way to replace the land or the land value that is there. And also it's, at the moment, there is no way to clean up the tailing ponds. So you're looking at irreversible damage. And I've walked through these tar sands, and it's pretty much like a war on the land. It's like there's cannons that fire off every minute to keep the animals from landing on there. And I think that's really important as well in terms of bearing witness, to have this témoignage, to actually witness what has already happened to the world. I know for me, once I witnessed this and perceived it, it took me almost a year to be actually able to verbalize what I'd seen and what this meant for us as who are we as human beings and a civilization that we've already come to this time. So what this set me about doing was to actually create an international campaign. As I said, the IPCC has called for this to be shut down, but the mechanisms by which this is happening on the ground already could give us some clues to what this relationship between art and activism could look like. So, you know, at the time I tried to activate the non-profit industrial complex, so a charity called Survival, to work on this. However, what we see is there's often a crisis of racism, of leadership within that sector. So that's where I quickly had to become an artist in the sense of creating NGOs, creating organizations themselves. We have to think of the creation of organizations themselves as artworks to feed the need that we needed an international campaign that was responsive and led by Indigenous communities, that put their communications at the center, and that brought this to an international audience. So a lot of the work to internationalize frontline resistance, to expose the Canadian government, to show the violation of Indigenous rights happened on such a grassroots, out of my bedroom in Streatham in South London. So I think that's something to really understand, that we are in a crisis within the movement itself, with the racism and the strategies and agendas are on the table there. So that's really. So one thing I want to talk about a little bit is that, when people come to climate justice and climate activism afresh, there can be this sense of this need for newness. And I think it's really important to understand there are cultures of activism, forms of activism that have been taking place for since time immemorial, that this crisis is part of a continuation of this violence to the land. And so often the forms of activism become a really big question for me, and how do we support them and bring them into being from the wishes of the communities on the front lines. So for instance, this was a healing walk that took place along the tar sands, and the community had been doing a lot of international exposure, a lot of talking about this destruction. And there was also a need to talk about the healing that was needed. So there's also this space of bringing resources to make happen what needs to happen on the ground. Now, it was impossible to get any funding or resources from the non-profit space. Can you imagine saying, we need money for a healing walk? It doesn't even enter into the paradigm of what the strategies are. So often, as organizers, we're self-funding these, we're making these activities happen themselves. So that's really thinking about broadening what is the culture of activism, what is being asked from the community versus what we're bringing with our agenda. And that's a real presence thing there. So I'm just going to shift gears a little bit now as well. So this is in London. And so part of the campaign that we had with the tar sands was to really expose the corporate links to the UK, to follow that thread. So BP, Shell, a lot of those corporations, all of the largest corporations are invested in the tar sands. And so we did some work around BP, and many of you might know that BP sponsors many of the major art galleries in the UK and across Europe. So the first step was to expose that relationship, not just because of the money which comes from these corporations to the art world, which is actually not very much considering what they get for it. They get the social license to operate, they get to clean up their act. This was just after the BP Deepwater Horizon. So essentially, they had a summer party, and we went outside the summer party with a group called Art Not Oil to bring the reality of that to that space. So what actually is this corporation involved in, and how is the art gallery complicit in allowing them to clean that up? So I think that's a really important thread of work that has been going, that would be interesting to continue. How do we, as well as moving forward with the art gallery, hold that complicity, understand where the resources have come from that exist in the current art world as well. So another part of the materials we can say that we work with is to look at the financial threads. What are the financial threads that connect to these projects that are happening far away? Again, to bring us into this map of how the climate crisis came about. So a lot of our work has been with shifting markets, with, again, bringing that reality to the shareholders, this is the BP AGM at the bottom, just after the Gulf disaster again, and to be in relationship to bring the reality of those spills, the fact that banks such as RBS, not only are they invested in carbon intensive projects, these are also projects that are illegal because they have not had the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous communities. So that's another important part of this, is that how within the IPCC do we see the protection of Indigenous rights? You know, the UN acknowledges that 80% of the biodiversity that we need to protect is on Indigenous territory. However, there is no mechanism for ensuring Indigenous rights within the CARP agreement. There's only a separate research platform. So that's a question. If most of the destruction is happening on Indigenous territory, but we have no mechanisms for that, it's a real question about how we work at that interface. So another thing we've been trying to expose, to show, is how the Canadian government and the UK government, this colonial relationship continues, that despite best efforts, for instance, from the EU to try and ban tar sands oil from coming into Europe, the Canadian government worked really closely with the UK. At the time, there was a trade negotiation happening between Canada and Europe to try and undermine these climate legislations. So even though we have climate legislations moving forward, the lobbying power, the revolving door between industry, banks and corporations is so deep that often a lot of these climate legislations are just wiped out for the interest of trade negotiations as well. So that's something that we have to really think about, that where within these mechanisms are we interacting with the lobbying that's happening. And so this is just an action as well. I just want to talk a little bit there that there's a real saturation of climate change in the media, and these policies can be quite obscure and, to be honest, a little bit boring. You know, I spent 5 years at the European Parliament working on this. So we're constantly thinking about how do we visualize this? How do we bring this to a new audience? So this was a installation with felt artist Lucy Sparrow to bring the felt impacts of the tar sands. And I know I'm a little bit over time, so I'm just going to scoot forward a little bit. Again, this is a hat that we made for Kate Middleton, getting this into fashion magazines, just to constantly bring that forward. And as Taru mentioned at the beginning, there now is so concretely made up of our climate justice ancestors, and culture is such a crucial part of the climate justice movement. I know that because Shell worked along with the Nigerian government to execute Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni 9, who were crucial in the mobilization of the Ogoni people to assert the rights of Indigenous people. So we know that the power of culture within activism is both key and crucial to mobilizing that. So this is an intervention that we did. Again, bringing the past into the present. This was a Vasa sculpture with a library and a film screening to bring those ancestors forward, and also to use this sculpture as a negotiation tool to try and get reparations for the devastation that Shell has been causing there. So, you know, as a lot of my work now as a researcher is dealing with the problem that we have, as we mentioned, of white supremacy within the movement. There has been a mobilization, but we have a real question of how do we keep, and this is the struggle within the struggle, how do we keep our voices in the center of this? How do we know the work that's been happened? How do we connect this to frontline movements? And art is crucial for this. I see this research as medicine to question our power, our positionality, so that we can rethink the strategies that we use in the movement going forward. And I think this comes out in the fact that we do have a broken telephone. While there's so much communication about climate change, it's not always connected to the front line. And I think this connects to this issue of care. You know, we're already in the crisis. We're already seeing mass cyclones. A huge chunk of the Himalayas glacier dropped off last week. It was nowhere in the media. So how do we connect and get out, make sure that we can move through the sort of the digital hyper real estate that has been hijacked by some of the larger brands, and how do we collaborate together to make sure that the next generation isn't having to deal with this white supremacy, and along with Greta there are other voices, and so these are just, you know, continually the ways that I have to find creative ways. This is a billboard outside of Soho House to bring the names of our community organisers forward, so that we can not only bring our names and our voices and our situations, but the deep strategies that we have in the climate crisis. just end there.
Thank you, Suzanne. So we have a little bit of time for discussion before there's the breakout rooms. So I thought that I'm sure you all have also questions and comments to each other, but maybe to kind of start this off, I thought I'll ask you all a question to kind of focus. There's so much there. So now I thought that maybe we'll focus on the kind of, okay, so what we were tasked to kind of figure out how to implement, how to set, this IPACC together. So I was thinking of last night's presentation from the vice chairs of IPCC, that how they emphasize that the assessment of the panel are based on scientific peer-reviewed literature, and they recognize that this is also a kind of an obstacle, that there's a necessity to have criteria, but at the same time, there's a kind of, it makes it difficult to acknowledge, for example, many forms of knowledge that they already actually recognize the significance of, for example, of the indigenous peoples. And now they're looking at ways of how to include these knowledge into the assessments when they cannot be, found in the literature as such. So how do you see, what could be the criteria for IPACC? That how could we ensure that it would include a diversity of knowledges, practices and perspectives in the arts, also possibly those that we do not even recognize yet as significant when we're thinking of the kind of long-term future goal. Where to start from in order to kind of actually have that kind of openness while still having kind of some sort of criteria that allows us to kind of move forward to kind of institute. So would everybody like to take turns? Maybe that would be the best. So who wants to go first? Suzanne?
I can start. I think one of the criteria that we could start with would be Ecocide. And given that at the moment this is going through the process of member states endorsing it, and I think it really sort of starts with the worst of the worst. So if we look at the tipping points, and I think that's a really good place to start. We often hear about the Amazon, but the Brazil is also a tipping point. So if we look at tipping points and we think about mapping out what is the devastation that has already taken place, like I said in the tar sands, we don't even have a cumulative impact assessment, the concrete devastation that has already happened. So there is the deep need for very concrete mapping to register the waterways that has happened, because industry is not doing that. It's so parceled up. So there needs to be an independent monitoring of extractive industries to understand the devastation that has already taken place. And I think the way that that could have a interdisciplinary angle to it is to work with traditional custodians of the land, to also look at the treaty rights that have been violated, because states such as Canada are also violating their own constitution and treaties. So that could also support the movement for sovereignty and for Indigenous rights and the health impacts that are happening there. And those also come with violent front lines. A lot of extractive industries continuing with the pandemic, it hasn't stopped. So I think a monitoring system that integrates Indigenous knowledge and brings resources to that existing work that needs to happen could be a great start. I'll pause there.
Thanks. Nataša?
Maybe I can take from here. Yes, I would just say that maybe going back to the question of what is art could be also a good criterion in order to be, let's say, to be sure that we can somehow carry on this field that we are talking about as well, and where does it intersect with the climate urgency. And I would say that, at least the way I see it, that it could be, how our governments are usually thinking in too much into in economic terms, and the kind of what does it bring actually? What does it mean? And so also it relates to the either let's say the one extreme is complete emergence, art related events or cultural events as a kind of what we saw before was this kind of cultural tourism. So that completely fed into carbon footprint that got excessive in art system, where artists and curators and everybody who is from art had to travel around constantly in order to sustain the project. So how to come around with this economics? I have been thinking a lot about the importance. It might sound weird, but the importance of art for public health. It's something that has been very much only seen through, let's say, art therapy, which is a kind of branch which is absolutely, left in more or less to certain interpretations of how art and music can influence our well-being. But I think, like, if just from the discussions that we had within the initiative, to think how racism destroys actually lives, how it influences that because of racialization, there are communities that have less life expectancy, how there is this gap in understanding like who has the access to actually to have the time and the access to think regarding climate urgencies while they're having to deal with on a daily basis with residues of racist colonial relationships, So how to think that everything is interconnected or is interdependent in that sense, in understanding art as something that contributes to better public health. I would be very much for thinking in those terms.
Thanks. Fernando?
Yes, well, thank you. I think that we have the mechanisms and we have sometimes frames that have been well signed and confirmed. For example, after many years, we managed to get the declaration, the UN Declaration on Peasant Rights, and that was addressing land grabbing and so on. There is also resolutions for indigenous people's rights that have been like very useful instrumental tools to for example, try to force the process of previously informed consent. I think that it's about really having the political will and the courage to open those spaces of participation and input of the communities that are directly affected by policies or by the effect of policies in their territory. So that has to happen both at national, at regional, and international level. And what we see is that many of the agreements and declarations that have been signed, and if I'm not wrong, for example, I think the agreement on children labor was not signed by the United States, for example, and things like that. So I mean, when the countries are not really like forced to put that in practice, then it's like a little bit of a wishful thinking. And then about the other question you were asking, Taru, about the possible role of the arts articulating, or like somehow giving body to the perceptions and the knowledges and understandings, that non-scientific agents have on the field. I think that, well, again, it's not so much about having to fit that form of knowledge in the box of what we understand as, valid knowledge, but actually to just establish also other rules of the game, other mechanisms, other forms of and spaces of influence. So, I mean, it's about opening much more spaces of dialogue. So you don't need to have like a written evidence and data gathering, to understand and to hear from a native person or about the vernacular knowledge, and experience of how climate change is changing for example, the vegetation of a certain alpine ecosystem. that's something they will tell, they will express. And we have used methodologies, for example, interviews that work with later poetry and then forms of spoken word that we are now, for example, experimenting with indigenous peoples and pastoralist communities. So yes, there are ways to later, like also in this form of participatory action research, empower the community by articulating what they are feeling, observing, and knowing.
We only have a few minutes left now, so maybe I'd also, invite you to kind of ask each other something or make comments. But I think there's kind of maybe something that we can discuss later on as well. Is this what comes up is the kind of a lot this emphasis, of course, on questioning what can be the art role in this, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary work that needs to be done. But I'm also interested. There's a kind of what you're also all saying in a way that is that the other disciplines are also allowing us to kind of really transform our understanding what the arts can be, and so there's a kind of interdependent relationship there already as well, kind of in a conversation between these different practices that are not monoliths. Like the sciences are not monoliths. The indigenous knowledges is not a monolith. There's the arts is not a monolith. So really kind of how to kind of situate, I guess, these knowledges. And is the kind of starting point somehow to kind of see how they can actually have a dialogue with each other in a meaningful way. But please, would you like to kind of we've got a few minutes, so I'll just open it up for you to also comment each other. Question. Anyone?
Maybe responding to what you're saying there, Taru, about this proposal, and I think within my own practice. Most of the resources I get comes from art to do this work, because there is a crisis within the climate justice industry. That the resources, the respect for Indigenous knowledge is so steeped within this white supremacy. It's one of the least diverse industries on the planet. So this need for almost art allyship, I call it, the space to do the research, to do this intersectional, interdisciplinary research, and to reflect on the forms of activism themselves and how they allow it to be a barrier. And also so we can come up with new forms. I often say we've never had to face a climate crisis in the times of fascism before. So we need new forms as well. Some of the forms have become tired because of this sense of urgency. It can stop self-reflection. So the space of art becomes a space for us to pause, to think about where we're at, to take stock, to assess the phenomenological on-the-ground needs, and to start injecting resources through collaboration, through resourcing, and spaces like this even, to start to think about that. So that's how I would really see it at the moment. There's a deep need for that allyship from the arts, especially for queer women of colour and frontline communities, because of this crisis of white supremacy in the movement itself.
Yes, I very much agree with Suzanne in the sense of allyship and alliances. And really, as I said before, also I think it also comes forth in the practices of Suzanne and Fernando. It's that not only understanding that art creates content, but it's really important to say, how does it create content? What are the methods of that creation? Are they in sync with what they are talking about? Are there, with the carbon footprint, with materials used, with talking, educating about the materials used? Where are they coming from? I mean, when for example, just as a case, when we did the exhibition with Nora Razian in Beirut, one of the attempt was to calculate the carbon footprint of all the production and the transportation. But not only that, also to include into the credits. When you talk about the work, and when you say which techniques are included into the installations or photographies, we tried really to trace and to ask the artists to trace where the materials are from and what already, just by doing this tracing, what does this mean for the carbon footprint of the work itself? So I'm just saying, I guess, the same thing that I said before about like how to do it, and going back to the questions of allying and alliances, it really goes in hand with commoning. So to go against the capitalist system of hierarchies and really trying to work on the idea of mutuality. and in commoning as a also as a system of economic organization finally. So I think art will, for the next 7 generations, I would hope that art really goes out from the grasp of focus on individuality of the artists, on the geniusness of the artists, and to rather think about how does it contribute in almost like in immediate way, of course, regarding the urgencies that we are facing, but also how does it contribute in as I said before, regarding the health issues, how does it contribute finally to what happens with us when we are working with it or are surrounded with something that has clear messages or complex messages in artistic sense.
I think we have about 1 minute left before we need to move on, and then there's going to be the breakout rooms. But Fernando, did you have something you want to say, or you leave that for the discussion? So thank you so much for this, and I hope that nobody vanishes now during the kind of break, but joins also the kind of after the breakout rooms, then the assembly where we can discuss this together and open up for all the other participants. So back to you, Inga and Bruno.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Taru. Thank you, Fernando, Suzanne, and Nataša. We will continue our discussion, as you said, in the assembly around 12:15.